Whether one is listening to this in Myanmar or from outside the country, we know it is a very difficult time for those of us who hold the Golden Land and its people in our hearts. In trying times like these, we can all use a bit more care and compassion in our lives. So, on behalf of the team here at Insight Myanmar, I would like to say, in the traditional way Metta is offered, may you be free from physical discomfort. May you be free from mental discomfort. May you not meet dangers or enemies. May you live a peaceful and happy life. And may all beings be free and come out of suffering. And with that, let's move on to the show. We welcome Lynn Bousfield on this episode of Insight Myanmar podcast. She has a long time history with Burma, with meditation, mindfulness, and therapy, and we'll learn about this inner journey, spiritual journey, and the role of helping others through this journey as well today, and maybe also get into something about the early spread of mindfulness to the West might be in there as well. So, Lynn, thanks for taking the time to sit down and talk with us about your own personal story and learning a bit about Burma in the process as well.
Thanks very much for the invitation, Joe.
So there's a lot to your story to get into, and I know that there's a start of it in your time in Bodh Gaya and your uh, relation that you developed with some of the great Burmese meditation teachers and bringing that to Australia and to other places around the world. Let's get to the early part of your story. If you could tell us a bit about your origins and family life and what set you on that spiritual life, and get into that.
Okay, yeah. So I grew up in Perth in Western Australia, but while Perth is the capital, it's a fairly small town as far as cities go. And it's probably fair to say, like a lot of young people, I wasn't particularly happy as a probably as a teenager, and a lot of bullying at school, that kind of thing. And I was at my first year of university, and my brother, who's a couple of years older, had been away traveling in Southeast Asia, and he sent me a postcard from Thailand. And the postcard had a picture of stupas on it. And I'd never seen anything like that, the traditional Thai covered in gold, or at least looked like gold to me. And so I was in the library at the University of Western Australia, and somehow I went looking for what this postcard was about. I don't remember what my brother might have written on the card or anything else other than that picture. And unfortunately, I also don't remember the book that I eventually landed on. But I read something, and I remember having the thought, it's still very distinct, that if you learn to meditate, everything will be okay. And so I quit university, much to my father's dismay, being the last child and the first one to go to university. I got a job for 6 months with in the public service, and surprisingly, after 6 months, I thought I had enough money to leave. And I left thinking I'd be away for maybe 3 months. And I was going to Southeast Asia as a fairly typical thing for Australians to do, to start our sort of exit from Australia in Southeast Asia because it was close. And I just used Southeast Asia as a bit of a stepping stone, trying to find meditation. And I went to Jakarta first, and then down to Bali, where I met a man who was into actually white magic, not black magic. And he taught me what I now can see was a concentration practice.
Mm.
And then I headed up to Java, and people were talking about a woman in Java who was teaching meditation, which was a Muslim practice that we did standing. And so I tried that. And then I got to Thailand, and I walked into quite a few wats, but they seemed very impenetrable to me at the time, sort of inaccessible. Went to Laos, and similar experience with the monks and the monasteries, and then went to Burma. And they, of course, were the days where you had a very short visa in Burma. I think it was 10 days. It might have been a week. I don't really recall. And at that point, I was just traveling with another Australian woman. And so we did a, quick tour of Burma in that time. And the main thing that stood out was arriving in Mandalay from the train. We got off the train and had no idea to go. I mean, this is, like 1975, so there's no mobile phones and social media and, internet to find your way around. It's just word of mouth. And there was a Burmese man came up to us, and he said, "Please come and stay at my house." And, we had a few experiences already in Southeast Asia that you would normally sort of shy away from something like that. But in Burma, there were no hotels. I found out from Burmese friends later on that Burmese people didn't stay in hotels. They stayed with friends. The idea of hotels is certainly at that point was just not something that particularly registered. And so I probably relied on my friend, who was a few years older, and she said, "Well, let's do it." So we went to his house, and he put us up, and he took us over the next 3 days to what he thought were all the important things to see in Mandalay. And, kind of, it was this sort of sense of, this is really unusual from my perspective. From his side, it just seemed really normal. And he just said, "You Western people, you have a very short time, and if someone doesn't help you, find the places to go to quickly, you'll spend all your time trying to find how to, what there is to see and how to get there." And because no one, there weren't that many people who spoke English, so it was a very sort of generous and gracious thing for him to do. And he apparently did it on a regular basis. He just waited at the train station, and someone got off and looked like they didn't know where to go. He would offer accommodation and then take them around to look at, what he thought were the important things to see. It's interesting. That's not the only thing that stood out from that 10 days when I think about it. At another place, I'm just trying to think of where it was at the moment. I think after Mandalay, we were staying somewhere and a group of young people came up to us. They would have been probably early to mid 20s, maybe a couple of women and a man. And they started talking to us in very kind of hushed voices about the situation in Burma, which I had, I was 18. I had really very naive about what was going on in the world. I didn't really understand what was going on in Burma, but that sort of stood in contrast to the Mandalay experience. There was this sense of there's something sort of subterranean going on here that's dark, and we want to get out. So yeah, I mean, after that, I went to India, and the first trip to India ended up in Dharamsala. But once again, I didn't really connect with the tradition, and then ran out of money, got really sick, and the plan had been to go to Japan to teach English, but didn't have enough money for the flight, so ended up in Iran. So this was in the days of the Shah, and I didn't manage to get a job teaching English because no one would believe I had a degree, because I actually didn't have one. I was too young. So I got a job as a typist and stayed. My friend and I, we stayed in a share house with an English guy and an American guy. And I was talking to the English guy, and he said he'd been in India and he'd heard about a retreat, and he was in Iran getting money to go back to do a retreat in this place called Bodh Gaya with a teacher called Manindra, and he gave me the dates. And he just said, "Oh, this is a bit how you do the practice. It's you have to pay attention to your breathing," and that then set me on the path to getting back to India. And I arrived in India 5 days into that retreat. It had already started. I remember going and meeting Manindra. He was staying at the Chinese temple at the time, and I arrived and said I'd heard about meditation, and I wanted to learn to meditate. And he was his usual buoyant, welcoming, accepting self, and which I discovered was part of his personality later on. He sort of jumped up and said, "Oh, you're in luck. There's a retreat it's already underway, but you can still join us. You just go down the road. It's at the Bila Dharamsala, which is like a pilgrim's rest house." And so I wandered off to find this place. Actually, I tell this story sometimes when I'm teaching, because I found the Bila Dharamsala and I looked through so it was like a compound, and with a wall around it, and sort of a gate at the front, and the gate was open, and I looked in and saw a sort of garden, very clipped kind of hedges and pathways, and I saw three people. There was a little stupa in the garden which had steps up the front, and there was someone walking very slowly up the steps, and someone else was walking very slowly along one of the paths. And on a distant wall, it's very common in India, there are often bathing places, there are like just pipes coming out of the wall. There was someone who had just finished bathing, wearing a lungi, like a sarong, but he had his back to me, and he had a towel, and he was very, very slowly moving the towel backwards and forwards to dry his back. And all three were wearing white, which again isn't that uncommon in India. But I looked in and saw this scene, and I just thought, this can't be the place. This looks like a mental hospital. But it was the place.
Mm.
And pretty soon I was in there, not necessarily wearing white, but moving around very slowly. And that was my first retreat. Only 5 days, but I guess I'd have to say it changed my life.
Mm-hmm.
There was a Bangladeshi monk there. His name was Rastrapal. He was a student of Munindra's. He was, conducting the retreat, so to speak. But Munindraji would come in on a regular basis and talk to people if they had any questions about their practice. I was given very little instruction by Rastrapal. Very simple instruction about observing the breath and anything else that might arise. And then he said, just watch what other people do. So mostly it was Indian people on the retreat. I think there were about 4 foreigners. And it was incredibly difficult. I remember feeling so much physical pain. I felt like I'd been run over by a truck. But yeah, the 5 days were kind of groundbreaking, really. And I suppose it just felt like this is what I'd been looking for. Not really even understanding, I don't think why. It just must have made sense to me at the time that this was something authentic and what I needed to do, what I'd been looking for how long it had taken me to get there. That's the other thing about the trip in Burma. I was on the back of a bullock cart in November in that year when I heard that the Whitlam government had been dismissed, which was also a fairly shattering piece of information. But so yeah, it had taken me just over a year, probably 15 months from when I'd left Australia and gone traveling through all of these places looking for practice and getting back to Bodh Gaya, which is where I then stayed for about another year and a half, largely in Bodh Gaya doing practice.
That's quite a story. It's lovely to hear that synopsis, and it's just so curious to think about having this interest in meditation. Especially you hear this in 2024 and many young people listening in, where there's just mindfulness and Buddhist sources up the wazoo these days. And at that time, being an 18-year-old from Australia and knowing that you wanted to practice meditation, but not necessarily knowing the next step, rather than just getting a flight to Indonesia, it sounds like, first, and experiencing perhaps some Muslim or Hindu or perhaps even just the magical types of teachers that you come across, and just wandering around looking at that time. Of course, that's how things were until very, very recently in human history. Just wandering around through happen chance or conditions being right, past karma coming to fruition, however one wants to characterize that, and wandering here and there, talking to this and that person, and hoping to land in a set of conditions with a teacher, with a spiritual community, where you have access to something that it's probably pretty nebulous even what it is you're looking for, because there aren't those resources. And going on that exploration through these regions and looking for something that vaguely matches this idea in your mind of what you're seeking out.
I think it was interesting, almost even the journey to find the practice.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I have to say that, I probably nearly died 3 times before I got
Mm.
to Bodh Gaya.
Wow.
Um, one was due to the dysentery that we both picked up, probably from Nepal, but the other 2 times were, the threats of going through countries like that at that time, probably even, of course, at these times. And again, being a young white woman who didn't have a clue,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
even though I never sort of dressed in a way that was, you know, revealing of anything. It was always, long, very, ankle length skirts and long sleeve tops, and but just by virtue of the fact that you're white and you're not accompanied by a man, um, we we sort of just escaped with our lives from an
Mm-hmm.
incident in Laos where we were basically hunted,
Oh.
and going across Iran and getting to Tehran, there were a couple of experiences in Tehran again where we were, we were just lucky to escape. So, you sort of, it's almost like the out in the world experience of, you just keep going with these incidents because there is something that is leading you, which is at this point just an idea. It's probably a little bit
Mm-hmm.
akin to a meditation practice where,
Mm-hmm.
you start and, yeah, like it doesn't seem like it's certainly an insight practice. It's like sometimes it feels when people start an insight practice like it's even worse than, what they thought it was going to offer, them, um, or allow them to escape from in their daily life. So I think it's interesting in that regard of, you know, there's got to be a lot of determination. I think not that you
Yeah.
necessarily recognize that as a young person, but something is difficult, and there's some idea, as you say, that there could be something else. You have no idea what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Even when you come across aspects of it, there's part of you that registers this is not it, and you
Mm-hmm.
keep going until there's this part of you that goes, this is it. You still don't
Mm.
know what it is, but something sort of rings true. Um, so, and yeah, for younger people these days, I think it could take the same amount of time and the same amount of difficulty because there's so much they have to wade
Yeah.
through. It's like,
Yeah.
again, where do you start? I mean, it
Yeah.
almost seems easier to get a plane ticket.
I mean, you have one course meditation students doing Instagram reels, educating others on what this whole silent meditation retreat is. They've sat one course and
Yeah,
they're suddenly making a name for themselves, trying to tell other people how to get through it. So
yeah,
it's a very different time.
yeah, very different. And I think, as I said, all of those things that people might try before they discover if it's meant for them, a practice like this
Hmm.
one, it is kind of equivalent. Um, but
Mm.
yeah, there was no, as far as I could tell, there was no meditation that I could have, no Buddhist meditation. There certainly wasn't any in Perth. And I don't think Prakanti Palo, who was, I think he was English originally, Prakanti Palo, maybe Australian, but he trained in Thai forest tradition. He came back and set up in with a nun, Ayakema, in
Right. Yeah, Robert
it,
Hover student.
yeah, they set up in a center in Wiseman's Ferry, bit out of, a few hours north of Sydney. That was happening when I got back. So I was away the first time for 2.5 years, and when I got back, um, I discovered that they were there, but I don't think they were there when I left. So,
Mm. Yeah, it was certainly a time where I've spoken to a number of people who are, I would say, the generation before me, and I was of a generation where it was more similar to that one than the one that came after it with the
mhm,
opportunities of the internet. But in so many of these interviews, it's a chance encounter, a book left in a hotel room,
mm,
something they heard from some other traveler that stuck in their mind. And for me, it was what was the year? I think it was the year 2000, and
mhm,
working in an office in Japan, in Tokyo, and
right.
also wanting to find this path that I think there were a few more resources available for me to, in the form of books at least, if not websites at that time, or social media. And just a coworker telling another coworker that happened to stop in the office about a meditation that he had done, and just hearing it, I was like, I think this is the thing I've been waiting for. And it ended
Yeah,
up being the Goenka Vipassana courses. And at that, these days it's almost impossible to have an interest in this direction and not hear about, say, the Goenka Vipassana courses, just as one example. At that time, it felt like I had found a pot of gold. It felt like I am so lucky to be at the right time and place where I heard about this thing that I would never have heard about otherwise. It just felt like this incredible luck that I had been in a place where I'd heard about this. And indeed, that's really until things changed with the internet, and it spread to the extent it has had now, that whether it was Goenka Vipassana, Munindra, Mahasi, Ajahn Chah, whatever these traditions were, that was kind of the feeling from, I don't know, 1960 to 2000 or so, where
mm,
you heard that name, got that book, heard that recommendation, someone told you about that course starting around the corner. And for those that were seeking, it was this, even before going, it was like, I think this is what I was waiting for. Gosh, I hope it is.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's very they're very interesting processes, I think, that bring us to these places, and but also, keep us there, because I guess that there's a lot of points along the way where
Yeah.
you could encounter something that, is life saving in the way that
Mm.
a vipassana practice is, and just kind of slide off,
Mm-hmm.
not not realize what you've got. So
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really fortunate that when you do find it, and it has a strong enough impact, and there's a strong enough engagement with you,
Yeah.
because it's also, and I was speaking to a friend about this recently, those days, and I mean, it was hard physically,
Mm-hmm.
really physically hard doing retreats.
Mm-hmm.
I remember the retreat at Bila Sala. I mean, I've never, or I can see sort of a bit more similar to a cross-legged position. Not that it's cross-legged these days, but I'd never been able to sit cross-legged, and here I was sitting on the concrete ground. They had like a tarpaulin on the ground or something, and a
Mm-hmm.
tarpaulin over the top. The heat didn't really bother me, but all these, Indian people just, plop down on the ground as
Yeah.
if it
Yeah.
was, an everyday thing, which it was an everyday thing. Um, and it was just in agony. I was trying to sit on my sleeping bag, and, then I'd go into my room. It was like a shared room with some other Indian women, and they'd just be lying down on a wooden bed with a straw mat on it, and I'm like, wooden bed with a straw. I had a bit of that already from traveling, but it was physically, it was pretty sparse. And of course, eventually, when I got to the Mahasi Center, when Burma opened in 1980, very similar conditions for living in. I was a bit smarter by then, so I had I think I had some kind of foam, compressed cell mat or something. But the difficulty with Burma then was the food, for me at least.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the really demanding schedules.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of tell my students sometimes of the Mahasi schedule, which is still burned into my brain from so much practice of it. There's not too many people who would follow that schedule these days from the West, I don't think.
I want to get to that Burma part of it, at least the first part now, because it's very interesting that you went there as a seeker, something of a naive seeker at that time, not really in kind of your tour of the region, and ended up there. And it's interesting for several reasons. I mean, one is that you're there in 1975. That's quite a difficult time for foreigners to come. It's a year after U Thant's funeral, which sparked these protests, and I imagine it couldn't have gotten a visa for much more than a week. But also, so many of the Western practitioners turned teachers now that I've spoken to on this platform, Burma was kind of their second or third stop, in the sense of being established before they went, whether through Goenka, Munindra, Mahasi, whoever it was, finding some, either directly with that teacher or with some disciple, establishing oneself a little bit in that practice, only a little bit, because there's not a lot of years we're talking about here. And then learning, oh, well, my teacher is in Burma, or there are greater opportunities in Burma, or you can ordain in Burma over here and do this. And speaking to people who then said, oh, okay, well, I want to go try that. So they're arriving in Burma with some very slight lay of the land and understanding in what they're really seeking. But it sounds like your visit was more happen chance, more of just kind of like going to Bali, Jakarta, Bangkok, Calcutta, anywhere else, and just kind of getting off a plane and trying to figure out what was in front of you.
Yeah, and I don't think whatever I read necessarily identified anything as Buddhist. And maybe even from my brother's postcard, I didn't have a sense of Buddhist. So
Right.
I don't think I really had an idea of Buddhist or Buddhism. It was meditation. So, which is probably why, in Java, I just went and tried the meditation practice with the Ibu. Ibu is a Bahasa Indonesia word that means mother. So older women are called Ibu. So she was teaching this practice, which was perfectly fine practice. But once again, it didn't click. So yeah, I don't think I knew I was looking for meditation. I didn't really know what meditation was. But each thing I tried, I realized this isn't it somehow. It's interestingly though, including that also included going to the Tibetan library in Dharamsala, but I think I can't remember how long I was there. It might have been a month or so, and they were like classes. So it was like going to school, and people were taking notes, and again, that to me this wasn't meditation. So that's why that didn't stick, even though it was Tibetan Buddhism. I didn't really register what that was either. So yeah, and having the English guy in Iran just tell me very briefly about the meditation practice. We must have got talking about meditation, he must have been interested as well, and he didn't tell me very much, but somehow at that point it was like, that's the place that I got to go to. And that was back to Bodh Gaya,
Mm-hmm.
before a lot of practice in India. I came back to Australia because I'd run out of money, and stayed in Australia for a year working, and then went back again to India and to Bodh Gaya largely. And I think it was at the end of that time that Burma opened. So I think I went I'm pretty sure I went straight from India to Burma for like a 3-month retreat, which would have been end of 1980. So that was the first time I knew I was heading for Bodh Gaya to meet Munindra.
Mm-hmm.
Munindra, of course, having done a lot of practice in Burma, and then I knew I was going to the Mahasi Center when I went to Burma the second time.
It's also interesting with Munindra that you landed with him. That's not so uncommon for the time. So many young spiritual seekers from the West ended up being guided towards him and his embrace and his teaching, as well as his guidance. But as you told your story and you mentioned coming to meet Munindra, and he told you, yes, there's a course over here and he's guiding you towards that course, I'm kind of waiting to hear if that's going to be a 10-day silent retreat by an Indian businessman or slow walking and, in the Mahasi style. And I almost get this feeling it was one of those moments of like, you could turn left or right. And if you had come a week earlier, maybe you would have turned left. If you came a week later, you turn right, because he was, Munindra was so open in terms of all these traditions and encouraging all this practice. And it seems also a bit of serendipity, or maybe something more, that that your arrival coincided with him leading you towards the Mahasi retreat, which ended up being so transformative.
I mean, that was the one that was running at the time.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah.
as you say, maybe if Goenka had been in town, I mean, Goenka came to town maybe a year or so later, and I did sit a retreat with Goenka because everyone said what a remarkable teacher he was.
Yeah.
But I guess I was still, I still didn't have this difference in technique thing figured out.
Yeah. Right.
I think I heard Vipassana, and so I got onto Mr. Goenka's retreat and discovered that it was a different practice.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh. No, I think I prefer Mahasi.
Well, I was talking to Graham White about this, and I really like how he put it, because he also vacillated with Mahasi and Goenka, and asking him about that, about his own path. He had this thing that always resonated in my mind after hearing it, of like, there's something about your first practice that has this hold on you like nothing else. And and that's why I mentioned that serendipity of, yes, you did, like Graham, you did Mahasi and Goenka. You did both of them, but in both your cases, you did Mahasi first. And I think maybe something similar. I've also spoken to I can think of some people in mind from that time who did Goenka first and then did Mahasi, and then just felt this pull back to Goenka. So, the fact that there happened to be a Mahasi course running when you ran into Munindra led you into that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, given my difficulty with sitting on the floor, I think the Mahasi technique was more designed for me. I think if I'd ended up in Japan, I probably would have been pulled to Zen, but I guess over time I would have learned how to sit that way, if I had to do it repeatedly. But there was something about the Mahasi practice it seemed kind of balanced and forgiving, and it just seemed very I didn't know it at the time, but as I've practiced more, it's just such a practical practice to me. It's just applicable everywhere, which I suppose is another reason why it's the basis for a lot of what's been being used under the heading of mindfulness these days in the West.
Mm. Can you give an example of what you mean about how you find the Mahasi technique in particular so practical in daily situations of life?
Yeah, well, I guess it's because the practice allows the development of mindfulness on whatever is the distinct object.
Hmm.
So it doesn't have to be the breathing or the walking. If it's a mental state or a feeling, then those experiences in everyday life can be investigated, observed and investigated with mindfulness. So even from a sense of not in a formal way, but in an informal way, for someone who's got experience in their practice, they can learn to be observing the condition of their mind, um, perhaps while they're in a meeting, or dealing with something distressing. Um, so it to me it's easy for it to move out of the formal practice of meditation to the everyday to an everyday application. And I think a really good example of that as well, which I probably didn't realize at the time, but it of course, as I practiced more and developed in myself more, staying a long time in India, I also met quite a few of Manindra's students. And also at the time, Antioch University, Robert Pryor actually,
Mm.
he brought students to Bodh Gaya for I think it was a comparative religious studies kind of program. And on the first course, I kind of helped with the setup of a couple of, the teachers, as well as kind of looking after, helping to look after the students, because they were all, well, they might have been older than me by a year or two, but they were landing, in India, in Bihar, Bihar state, one of the poorest states of India,
Hmm.
straight out of America, and it was bound to be quite a shock. So one of the teachers that was a woman, her name was Krishna. She was a Barua, like Manindra, so it's
Right.
Krishna
Yeah.
Barua. And her father-in-law had been a monk, and he taught, I think he was the one who initially taught her to meditate. Now, he may have been a student of Manindra's, I'm not sure of that connection, but because Krishna was married and had children, um, she wasn't available, or maybe even allowed, given permission to do meditation retreats. So she described to me how she turned her day into practice by being mindful of everything that she did.
Hmm.
From preparing the meals to cleaning to going to the market, like everything, she turned into almost a retreat.
Mm.
Um, and she was a pretty astonishing woman, and clearly a well-established practitioner. So I think it's always to me as a great example of how we can practice
Yeah.
with everything,
Yeah.
everywhere. you know.
That's so important.
Mm,
Yeah, I think that, and I'm probably jumping ahead here, but as I look at mindfulness today, I kind of see, at least as it spread in the West, I kind of see the dangers of two polarities. One being this kind of craving and crutch, really, of ideal retreat conditions, and a
mm,
kind of an inability to practice outside of these ideal silent retreats on one hand, and then on the other hand, a real kind of watered down, uh, just lukewarm mindfulness that is integrated into anything from corporate retreats to to
Wine
um,
tasting.
right, whatever, without any Sheila, without any of that,
Yep.
and so it's and so with one or the other, you're missing out on so much. And like, where are you able to have this pure distillation of what this mindfulness is, but to bring it anywhere and to not have to really rely on and be dependent upon certain external conditions as one's only means to practice.
Yeah, I think, you know, uh, I, I think the insight journey is a journey, through the storm of the
Hmm.
mind, um, and I think the, in a sense, the sometimes the journey through the storm of life is the journey that you do to get to the to the journey through the storm of the mind. Um, so as our conditions become more and more comfortable, um, I think it tends to train people to try to avoid the discomforts of life. This,
Hmm.
rather than investigate them.
Hmm.
And I mean, that's not necessarily a criticism or a judgment. I think if we can, alleviate sort of pain or suffering through other means, then, you know, we should make sort of intelligent decisions about the, what we've got our disposal but all too often it just goes to the, what's easy, as opposed, because it's available, and
Hmm.
rather than, you know what may be more intelligent and more beneficial. There's a
Hmm.
We play the short game. um,
Yeah.
no one's playing the long game, and our
Mm.
culture trains us, to play the short game. And the game's getting shorter and shorter. you
Yeah.
know
Yeah.
like, what can you achieve? Your key performance indicators, your goals, even in therapy, your treatment goals, and they've got to be smart goals. They've got to be measurable. It's just like everything is, you know sort of headed towards, mm, quick quick and measurable, as opposed to wide and deep.
Mm.
And I think if we're not careful, we train the whole system to go, quick and measurable, and we lose the capacity to go wide and deep.
Yeah. Yeah. And meditation is reduced to a mind hack.
Yeah,
Just a quick fix to how to get a shortcut. The definition of hack is has a connotation of wanting to get a shortcut from here to there, something you can you can do faster than the normal process, and
yeah,
mindfulness does kind of happen at its own time.
yeah. So, like, why would I put myself through some excruciating conditions of,
Mm.
alternating sitting and walking practice? I
Yeah.
mean, the conditions don't have to be excruciating.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this is the other interesting thing. It's the balance of those conditions. Um, and when I look at my own practice, you know, the first year I went to the Mahasi Center, again, there was a handful of foreigners there, and, you know, 500 monks and nuns, and lay people, Burmese, and it was pretty. I mean, if I'd felt like walking into the Biladam Sala was like, hang on, this looks like some kind of mental health, facility.
Hmm.
When I walked into the Mahasi Center, it felt like, it was this sort of concentration kind of,
Mm.
palpable kind of concentration sort of generator, or but I think I'd been there about 3 weeks, struggling, and it was Mahasi's birthday, so they have a big celebration, apparently, and they were concerned that the foreigners would find that too disruptive of their meditation practice. So they decided that the foreigners should get trucked out to a branch monastery. And so we were away, I think, for about a week at this small little monastery where we slept we practiced and slept in the sort of shrine room. And a couple of nuns cooked for us. And it was in the forest, whereas the Mahasi Center is huge.
Yeah, downtown.
Downtown, lots of buildings and concrete, and this place was like this little place, out in the bush, to use Australian vernacular, and the food was, well, I would probably say now more conducive to my tastes and at the Mahasi Center. And once again, it felt like my practice, I guess I relaxed. So my practice felt like it was, easier and more accessible. And I didn't want to leave there. I didn't want to leave and go back to the Mahasi Center, but I had to. So also when at one time in India, I went up into the foothills of the Himalayas. Just trying to think of the name of the town now. It's gone out of my... Dalhousie. It was a place quite a few people used to go and do practice. Quite a few Goenkawalas used to go there to escape from the heat of the plains as well. Sort of old hill station. So I went up to rent a house for a period of 3 months to escape the heat of the plains. And I found this house, sort of, I guess, like a British kind of old colonial sort of residence with a little wing off it, which had like a bedroom and a kitchen and a sitting area, and out the front of it was an apple orchard. And if you walked to the edge of the apple orchard, you had about a 270-degree view of snow-covered mountains. And once again, my practice, once I settled in, just felt like, despite the difficulty of practice, it still felt like it had ease. And I think these experiences probably have also fed into the way, the style of the retreats that I've been teaching for a while in Bali. I think it's really, really important to have environmentally suitable conditions as well. Not, I mean, a good teacher is critical, but having other supportive conditions, it can also make a really big difference.
Yeah. So talking about that experience with Mahasi and first that first course that Munindra guided you to in India, and then from there going back to Burma. You'd already been there, not as a meditator, but going to spend 3 months there. I'm sure that was a pivotal set of years in your life. And I wonder if you can describe the nature of the Mahasi courses you were doing in India, who the teachers were at the time. And then as you've talked a little bit about your experience walking into the Mahasi Center, but if you could expand on just the difference of what it was like to find yourself in Burma at the Mahasi Center, having principal teachers that are now commanding and giving instructions and overseeing, and what kind of difference that was as you went along the spiritual journey.
I think there's similarities and there's differences. Certainly that first retreat, there was very little guidance. But the instruction I got was, in fact, in a sense, all I needed. it was a very simple instruction from Rostropal at the start of the retreat. There weren't interviews. And again, I was only there for 5 days, but as I said, Manindraji would come in, and I remember talking to him one day. Maybe I was asked if I wanted to see him, and maybe I thought I was supposed to, and so I did. But I also remember I didn't have a clue what he was talking about. So it was like I just really didn't understand the language. It was English, but I didn't understand the language of practice, because I guess I didn't have words for what I was experiencing. And when I went to Burma, we listened to a tape initially, which I think was Alan Clements had read the tape. It was translated into English, not by Alan, but by I can't remember by whom. So we listened to, I think it was about a half hour, 45-minute tape recording of the meditation instructions, which between that first retreat and the Mahasi Center, Manindra had given us access to some recordings by Joseph Goldstein.
Yeah.
And in that time before I went to Burma, not only did Goenkaji come to Bodh Gaya, but Christopher Titmus came, and I sat a retreat with him, and Jack and Joseph came, and I sat a retreat with them. So by the time I got to Burma, I probably had more understanding of, what I was meant to be doing. But mostly, unless they were Western-led retreats, of which I did maybe 2 or 3 over that time, there were no talks. The whole Dharma talk thing was happening, of course, in Burma for the Burmese, but there was nothing in English for the foreigners. So there was a 5-minute interview every 2 days that was through a translator. And I remember that was a struggle. I remember being befriended by a Burmese woman who was practicing at the Mahasi Center at that time. And she spoke some English. She'd been to Australia, I think it was under a particular, some sort of, plan Australian government may have had with some other countries to help with the education, of essential kind of workers, and she'd had nursing training in Australia. So she had a bit of English, and every morning, once she sort of, befriended me on the way to breakfast, I would stop at her room and she would ask me about my meditation practice. So I don't remember much about that exchange in terms of, learning about the actual practice. And probably the same from the interviews, because the Sayadaws never really said very much. Mostly what you would get was good. That was about it.
Yeah.
So I think the exchange with the Burmese woman was more an exchange of feeling cared for. And, sort of cared for in the concrete environment of the meditation center.
Right.
Or connected with, perhaps, that someone was having a sort of yeah, I can't think of a better word other than connection or engagement. And she'd, I think, been asked by the Nugaha, perhaps, as well, to keep an eye on the foreign meditators, to sort of, because they realised, that it was difficult for us. And once again, I was still pretty young at that point, so I probably got sort of, marked out as, this young woman who perhaps, better keep an eye on.
Yeah.
But I found that very supportive. So, yeah, there's different. I guess there's a whole bunch of different things that support us to do the practice, and it's not necessarily a talk, a Dharma talk, or an instruction.
Right. And that also gets into some of the real fodder and richness that we go into with some of these discussions for people who've spent time in Burma, is that often practitioners who go to Burma as lay yogis or ordained as monastics may think they're going for a technique or a teacher or, again, these kind of perfect idealized practice environments. And certainly those things are a big draw, but many of them end up finding that it's the richness of the culture, of the people, of the Buddhist values that are being manifested in ways that holistically that you don't see in our communities, that have as great, if not greater, of an impact on the spiritual development as the intensive courses that one is actually undertaking. And so, in your case, as you went back there in 1980, have now as a practitioner, knowing what you're doing and being in a Buddhist culture, be it monastic or forest or perhaps with relationships, or if you went off monastery land at times and met Burmese people in society. But in what ways, beyond the particular teaching or technique or practice periods, in what ways was your proximity to Burmese Buddhist culture and friends and community, in what ways did that start to shape and influence you?
Well, in those early days of going to Burma when it first opened, you didn't really have a chance to go anywhere else. You got picked up from the airport and you went to the center, and then from the center you went back to the airport, basically.
Right. Yeah.
Um, so I think it was those because the teachers were men,
Hmm.
and they probably didn't really have that much impact on me at the
Hmm.
time. But I realized, as I guess I realized as I got older, the importance of the women who weren't in those teaching roles,
Hmm.
but who, like this woman, Dola Mint, her name was,
Hmm.
um, who'd actually, you know, told me later, in a later visit to the center, that her first time to the Mahasi Center was when she was diagnosed with throat cancer.
Hmm.
No, her first time was when she had an end to a relationship and she was really unhappy. So she went to
Hmm.
the Mahasi Center and practiced, and she said, she got through her unhappiness.
Hmm.
The second time, which was the time when I was first there in 1980, and I didn't know this, but because she didn't tell me until a subsequent visit, she had throat cancer.
Hmm.
And being a nurse, she had sort of medical colleagues, and they'd all, entreated her to, have surgery or to have chemotherapy, and they weren't giving her very good odds, apparently, with those treatments. It was like a 50-50 success sort of
Hmm.
a possibility. And she just said, I think I'll go and meditate, because it helped me last time. And she did intensive practice, I think, for about 9 months, and the tumor in her throat disappeared.
Oh, wow.
And she, there's a little booklet. Someone did an interview with her and published it, and it's published in English. I think it was available in Burma. She went back and saw her medical colleagues just to get, because she had an experience where she wasn't thinking, oh, my cancer's gone. She was just noting what was going on, and after the retreat, she went and saw her colleagues, and they did some tests, and they were just astonished that there was no sign of a tumor anymore. I suspect she's about 20 years older than me, so I suspect she's probably still alive. She was the last time I was in Burma. So I guess it was her, it was the nuns when we went sort of off campus that time when it was Mahasi's birthday. Just their care. And it was the same when you see, U Pandita became, I think when Mahasi died, I think they nominated 4 Sayadaws to run the Mahasi Center, sort of as a group, and 3 of them died very quickly. And U Pandita was the youngest, and so he then became the abbot. And I feel like I developed a good relationship with Sayadaw U Pandita. He was, a lot of people found him very fierce, but I always found him very kind, and he had a really good sense of humor as well. And then he left the Mahasi Center, which was a pretty sad day for everyone when he left. And I was there that year, and when I next was thinking to go back to Burma, I wasn't sure, where was I going to go? Was I going to go to the Mahasi Center, or was I going to go to Sayadaw's new center? I think he just had the city center at that point, which was quite small. And then I was told about Sayadaw Kundala. So I decided to go to Sayadaw Kundala's center, and I think Sayadaw Kundala was very, very sweet, very, very knowledgeable, and an exceptional teacher. And it was the first time I felt like I had the chance to sit down with a teacher of that caliber and kind of go through even past practice and past practice experience. And they were happy to spend the time doing that. So again, I think it's those instances, even though most of my time in Burma, certainly in those earlier years, was in meditation centers, it was the care of the people.
Right. And as you were going and spending more time there, you reference you have really evocative imagery of your 1975 visit, of painting a picture of the generosity, the curiosity, the kindness and the softness, and yet the underlying fear and terror and darkness that was always just around the corner, and just and devastatingly so continues to this day, which is what we hope the current situation will be resolved to give that freedom and safety they so deserve. But as you came to spend more and more time on repeated trips to Burma, associating with teachers, nuns, other fellow practitioners, how did you come to understand the kind of role of the political situation, the dictatorship, the lack of freedoms, with the ultimate freedom of this spiritual practice. And I don't know if there are anecdotes that might illustrate this, or general overviews of a picture you can paint as someone who would spend extended time there. And I understand that, at least at the beginning, it was more at centers than in society, and there's a language difference, and Burmese are often careful not to share their burdens or their problems by talking about things, and then there's their own lack of safety. But I'm sure to some extent, the amount of time you spent there must have been more examples that you gleaned and feelings you had of this kind of relationship, and the strain uh, that Burmese were living under, while also paradoxically pursuing this gift of spiritual freedom, which was also flourishing in their country.
Yeah, well, I think in the earlier years, um, probably not so much the first trip, um, but as I made more visits there,
Mm-hmm.
um, you just learnt that you had to be careful. You had to be careful, particularly, in taxis, not to engage in any conversation
Yeah.
around, politics. I had an experience with one of my Burmese friends uh, once when I was on the phone to him, and someone had told me about some incident with Saidari Pandita, and I can remember saying something to my friend around, "Well, I've just heard this, and could this happen? Is this, what, this couldn't happen, could it? This is not."
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
the tone of his voice
Mm-hmm.
completely changed,
Mm.
and it was just, and when that happened, I realized my mistake, and I just shifted off the topic. Um, and so there was, uh, I guess there was just an understanding that you didn't engage with people about those things. Certainly, maybe almost at any time, um, until the situation started to become a, a little, maybe what appeared to be a lot more open, when the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi were in power,
Mm-hmm.
and it was a marked difference that people actually started to speak openly
Yeah.
about the political situation, and it was quite marked. It sort of, you were taken aback that, in earshot of other people, the person that you were talking to was talking about, the government and the situation that they were in. Um, but up until that point, there was always the sense that you didn't know who was listening,
Yeah.
and so you just didn't talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's definitely a heaviness of those years, and that juxtaposition, and learning how to navigate in that environment, really deferring to those people that are on the ground and have a more sharpened radar from those years of living in those conditions, and taking the lead from them. And as you're there pursuing Mahasi meditation, studying under initially Mahasi Sayadaw and then Sayadaw U Pandita and then others that would come along, eventually at some part of your story, you transition from being a practitioner to also a teacher, or setting up and establishing retreats in Australia, perhaps first to bring in other teachers that are coming to lead them and then taking that role yourself. So can you talk about that transition to how it developed, that you then played a role in facilitating the sharing and dissemination of these Mahasi style teachings in Australia and perhaps other places as well?
Yeah, I guess I guess that started primarily with Graham, and I remember at some point Graham saying something about, it was difficult that there weren't more people around that you could talk to about the Dharma.
Mm,
And he, I think, had met and sort of established some degree of a relationship with Joseph in the early days in India.
right. Hmm.
And I guess I just said, well, why don't we invite them
Yeah.
to teach? And so he, I think that's how the first retreat came about, and which was held somewhere in the North Coast in New South Wales.
When was that?
It must have been around about 1983 or
Hmm.
84, somewhere back then. I'm not very good with dates.
Hmm.
And I think we had Joseph out a couple of times, maybe with Sharon as well. But it's like, it's a long trip, and I guess also at that time things were getting busier and busier for them, and it then seemed like we couldn't actually get them to come. So it seemed like we ought to invite one of the Sayadaws. So I think I'd been back again to Burma for a longer retreat by that point. So we wrote to the Nugaha, and I think we nominated a Sayadaw who might have spoken English, who was in Penang.
Hmm.
That might have been Sayadaw Utondara.
Mm.
But we got what we got back from the Mahasi Centre was, given that this was the first trip to Australia of for a Mahasi teacher, it should be Sayadaw Pandita.
Mm.
So Sayadaw came out with quite an entourage, and we rented a venue about an hour and a half out of Sydney in the Southern Highlands of a former girls' convent, sort of school convent, and I think that first retreat was a 1-month retreat. We had a lot of people. We had quite a few of the American teachers come in for that retreat as well. So we did a few of those with Sayadaw Pandita. He, I guess helped spur us on. We had a property that was, we were looking for land, but it was difficult to find something, and we had this idea of building a center, and then one of the people involved in the group had bought a property on a couple of acres, and basically said, well, why don't we turn this place into a center? And it was a sort of complicated handover. I think they kept part of it, and eventually we were able to give them, the association was able to give them some money for it, but we built a small centre there, and Sayadaw Upandita taught at that centre as well. And then we had Sayadaw Kundala come out. We had Bhante Sajiva, who is a Chinese Malaysian teacher who also has been a student Sadhuru Panditas, I think. He was at the Mahasi Center in those early days for some time as well. He's been in Italy for a long time, but I believe he's now headed back to Malaysia. I guess we invited a sort of whole, array of different, teachers in the Mahasi tradition. So I suppose what happened was, trying to maintain people's, not only their interest but their practice in between retreats, because the retreats took a fair bit of organization, and we might have been doing group sittings at the time, and then encouraging people to start, group sittings in their own areas as well. And I think the first retreat I might have taught might have been with Steve Smith in in Hollyhock, off Cortez Island off Vancouver. I think he wasn't teaching with Michelle at that point. And I was also, I'd come back from, this time in Asia. As you recall, I dropped out of my university degree before I left. So I came back, and I didn't really have any qualifications in terms of being able to work. And I had an interest in Southeast Asian studies. I thought that would be interesting, but it wasn't available. It was, I'd have to go to, 3-hour drive away to be able to study it from where we were living. So I thought I'd study psychology, because that must be like meditation, right? It must be about the understanding of the mind. So I went off and studied psychology, and it felt like I kept waiting for them to deliver the goods. And I kept waiting, and ended up with a master's degree, and still didn't feel like they'd got it. So I was now qualified as a clinical psychologist, and I didn't think anything was as good as meditation, of course. So I just, my first job was at a pain clinic in Sydney. And I applied for that job because, I thought meditators knew a lot about pain. And fortunately, the doctor running the clinic was reasonably broad-minded. It was the first pain clinic in Sydney that was multidisciplinary, and he was kind of open to, things like acupuncture. Might sound astonishing if, you're in America, but Australia was sort of, this would have been 1992. Those things weren't necessarily considered, orthodox. So, but a pain clinic, they could get the idea of relaxation. So I called it relaxation. And after a year, I changed all the paperwork to meditation. And that's probably, in fact, that's probably where I first started teaching meditation, was at the pain clinic. That would have been before I went off and did anything, I guess, down the track with Steve. So I had to teach meditation to people with chronic pain. And I was at the hospital, but I was also working with the doctor in his private practice. So I guess over time, what happened was I developed a language to try to convey to people what meditation practice was about and what it could offer them, and yeah, that was probably how I first started teaching. And some of those, because I was in private practice, then I was seeing people who they were presenting with all kinds of issues, not just with chronic pain. So pretty much, as I said in that synopsis I sent to you, I think in all of the 30 years I've been a psychologist, there's probably been 2 people who I've not taught to meditate because they didn't want to meditate because of their belief system, and they thought it was Buddhist. And I also suppose because of my background, in those early days in India, there was no sort of Buddhist envelope or wrapping. So there was nothing like precepts, or there was no, discourses, no Dharma talks. Over time, of course, having, had people like Sayadaw U Pandita in the country, and he would give talks that were translated, and of course more books were becoming available. So there was stuff you could read about. But certainly in those early years, it was about translating my practice to clients, and then getting to a point where I realized, well, where are people going to go when they stop seeing me as a psychologist? Because I haven't delivered it to them as a religion, like quote unquote. So if they want to keep doing their practice, what are they going to do? So I started setting up like classes out of a yoga studio, and then other people would hear about it. So I'd have 4-week courses, and then day-longs for people who'd done a 4-week course. And then after I had done that for a while, it was like there were some of those people who wanted to do more, and that's when I started the Bali retreats.
Right, and then you also have been involved in the development of the Blue Mountains Insight Meditation Center. Where along your journey did that start to take place?
So the Blue Mountains Center was the center that initially was that property that was owned by friends who offered the property for our use as a center. So that was in the mid-'80s. That's what's called the Blue Mountains Insight Meditation Center. So it basically started with Graham and I, and gradually just pulling together piece by piece things like newsletters, and doing group sittings, and inviting teachers, and these using the conference center at the convent, and then we couldn't get that anymore. It would just evolve by default. Like, a lot of people started using the convent to run all kinds of conferences, so we couldn't get dates. And then it was like, actually, we really need our own property. So we go looking for land, and then the friend says, well, that's right, he put his property on the market and couldn't sell it. And so then it was like, why don't we use this as a meditation center? And then we might have had a committee at that point. And then we just went into fundraising mode, and trying to set this very old house up in a way that it could accommodate a small group. We converted the garage into a meditation room. it's kind of developed over time with more accommodation built since Graham and I have no longer been involved in it. But yeah, as I said, we did end up inviting a lot of those teachers, Kundala, Sajiva, Upandita, Ulakana. They all came to that centre in that, in those early years. But there was a bit of a, I mean, Stephen and Michelle came as well. But I think, we had a huge involvement of the Burmese community. As soon as the Burmese knew that the Sayadaws, were coming, it was like all hands on deck.
Yeah.
They did a huge amount of work in terms of fundraising for the centre, in volunteering, coming up to help and to cook. And of course, some of them became meditators as well. They'd never meditated in Burma. This is the first time they meditated. So that was, really fantastic for them too. Yeah, so that was sort of the evolution of the Blue Mountains Centre. It sort of got a little bit shifted on its axis, although I think it's shifted back because there's some people on the committee weren't happy with, the amount of work entailed in bringing monks in because of all of the rules that had to be followed. So,
Sure.
So there was a little bit of a schism there for a while, but it seems to have sort of shifted back a bit now because a lot of the they're not just Western nuns now, but also I think there's a Nepalese nun who's been coming to teach at the centre, and there's been a couple of the other nuns who have spent a long time in Burma themselves, who've come to teach. But I haven't had much to do or anything to do with the centre really now for a very long time.
So this center and the work that you and Graham were doing, it'd be fair to say this was really the mark of the beginning, along with the Goenka community that was also forming right around the same time, and actually right around the same area as well in the Blue Mountains.
Yeah, right around the corner, basically.
Yeah, right around the corner. That this activity, it's funny because IMS and in Massachusetts is also just right around the corner from Damodara. So
right.
funny how that happens. But this could really mark kind of the opening or the beginning of Dhamma coming to Australia. That bit you were doing.
Yeah, there is actually a book, which somewhere I have a copy of. I think it's called The History of Buddhism in Australia. And I purposefully wrote a piece to go in that book because we must have got notified by whoever was compiling it that, did we want to contribute something? So, in terms of our history. And so, yeah, I think if I could find a copy of that book, I guess I wrote the piece, so it may have it delineated, with dates, etc., a little more. I don't think in the end anyone's name is particularly mentioned. It's more just positioning it in time and with what was happening. But it's sometimes hard to get that timeline.
Yeah.
But I guess the meditation center ultimately, of course, is the work of many. And some of those people who came as students are still involved. I mean, Graham and I primarily started it because we'd both come back. I first met Graham in India, but we'd both come back and were obviously very keen about meditation.
Yeah.
And then the people who've heard about it through, offering the retreats, have themselves become much more involved, and some of those people are still involved and still, I think, on the committee, running the center, and some of them might even be, teaching retreats there.
And so, as you were bringing this taste of Dhamma for really perhaps the first time in this new environment, and this was also a topic we discussed in Graham's interview and get his comments on, and want to get yours as well. After having spent all of this time in its native ground, so to speak, India and Burma and around here, and the hard conditions that were faced, the adaptation to so many things that had to happen as a practitioner, you really had to bring yourself to it rather than the other way around. And as you started to bring the practice to your home country and to start retreats there, what did you notice about the way that people oriented towards the practice? What challenges did you face? What differences did you find? And the contrast of how it was being practiced in back in those environments you had learned it, and how it was now being disseminated here, and what were your considerations in trying to think about the authentic way to bring it. I know that's a lot there. It's also it's interesting in contrast, because when you think about this in contrast with the Goenka courses, you don't necessarily have those same considerations, because you have a 10-day course that was designed, modified, and really codified by Goenka, that at least that part of it can just be kind of copy and pasted in these different environments where it goes. There's other considerations along with that, but the course format, the community, the rules, the instructions, that is all in kind of a neat package where there's a little bit less mental work that has to be done and how it's taken and exported. But what you guys were doing, it was much more, I think, exploratory, more the Wild West, more of kind of figuring out how to chart your own path and what you were doing. And so what do you remember about those early years of just trying to figure out how do we bring some version of what we had? It's not going to be the same thing because it's a different environment, but how do we construct a similar version to what we had and bring it to people here where it might be their first exposure?
Well, I think because the first teachers we had were the Americans,
Uh-huh.
I think they brought their model
Right.
of whatever Joseph had decided a 10-day retreat might look like, for example. That was probably what happened. I mean, I wasn't at that first retreat. It was up the North Coast, and I was probably working or studying or something. I think Graham might have managed it, so he may remember that himself. But it was probably whatever model was being used at IMS, for example. But they, I think even Stephen and Michelle, when they came, they had some version probably of that. But when the Sayadaws came, it was closer to a Mahasi model.
Uh-huh.
So 8 precepts, whereas the Western teachers would do 5 precepts usually. It was always 8 precepts with the Sayadaws. We wouldn't get up at 3 a.m. Might have been 4 or maybe even 4:30. Walking and sitting periods, I'm pretty sure, were probably hour sit and walk, like Burma, whereas the Western teacher retreats had sort of wound a lot of that back to 45 minutes a lot of the time. Sometimes it was hours, sometimes it was 45 minutes. But yeah, the Sayadaw-led retreats was just, not necessarily 3 a.m. to 11 p.m. It might have been 4 a.m. to 10 p.m. So, but that said, I distinctly remember one of U Pandita's talks before we had our own center. And it was funny because, of course, or I shouldn't say of course, but meditation retreats in Australia, probably the same in America, the food was always vegetarian.
Mm-hmm.
And it was going to the Mahasi Meditation Center for the first time when I stopped being vegetarian,
Mm-hmm.
because it was like I can't survive
Yeah.
on vegetarian food in Burma, because the centers was a lot of meat,
Yeah.
because meat was given because that was considered the best you can give.
Yeah.
And people wanted to give their best, and so that was meat. So there was all this meat. So cider would come, and we'd have Burmese food. Burmese would provide food for the Sayadaws, so that they weren't, that they were eating something that was, familiar to them. But Sayadaw Pandita knew that the yogis were on a vegetarian diet, and he was giving this talk, and the talk was really about, the way I've interpreted it is meeting the conditions.
Mm-hmm.
And he wanted to say pork, I think he did say pork cooks best in its own fat.
Mm-hmm.
But he made a joke of it and said something like, maybe you have to translate that as tofu cooks best in its own
Right.
juice or something.
Yeah.
So and by that he also meant, you need your own teachers.
Uh-huh.
It wasn't just, I mean, they considered, of course, they were the Sayadaws,
Yeah.
he'd been a monk since he was 7 or something, or some
Yeah.
era, and then they
Yeah.
immensely trained, trained
Mm-hmm.
in meditation practice. Not anyone becomes a meditation teacher. That your meditation practice has to, be worthy of of becoming a meditation teacher.
Mm-hmm.
But they have a lot of scriptural training, astonishing, um, abilities. One of my teachers in Burma, at one point, he used to teach from Sayadaw Ukundala's center, or he would stay there when he was in Rangoon. But he had he was the abbot, or appointed the abbot of a Mahasi center in a town down south called Bait.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like Myeik, Myeik, I think is the
Mm-hmm.
spelling when you look at it on the map, but it's pronounced Bait. Old rundown Mahasi center. And he was a Sutta Pitaka Sayadaw, which means he's memorized the suttas. So there's no way I'm going to ever be capable of doing
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So there's, like, I think U Pandita was registering that communication is going to be more easy when you've got people who understand where you're from, and your language, and you need diet that works for you. You need conditions that
Mm-hmm.
that work for you. So even under difficult conditions, I think even under difficult conditions, I think he also meant, you can still be practicing. That first retreat, so much work had gone into it. It was a really big retreat because Sayadaw was coming. We had a whole entourage. I mean, he was just Sayadaw Pandita landed on the plane. I mean, they weren't going to send him off on his own.
Yeah.
I think Alan Clements was there.
Uh-huh.
Unyana Ponika, the translator, was there. Sayadaw
Mm-hmm.
Pandita was there, and he might have had 2 other monks. So we had this whole little, group of monks. Alan was still a monk at that point, I think. And the retreat started as they normally do on a Friday night. So then we had the weekend, and then on Monday, unbeknownst to us, the council had decided to build a road behind the venue, and we had all of this earth moving equipment making a racket, and it was so bad that we could feel vibrations in the building.
Mm-hmm.
And we were
Wow.
just going, oh no.
Mm-hmm.
How long is this going to go? And,
Mm.
Sayadaw just, just got to note it. Not, this is terrible. Why have you picked this place? There was it was meet the conditions. And
Yeah,
I guess
that's
that
nice.
they are used to, noisy conditions in Burma, of course.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, um, I think as far as the retreats that I guess I was trying to language my own instruction to clients, to help them understand and not use anything that's might sound Buddhist.
Uh-huh.
Not that I necessarily knew a lot about that anyway, but the first retreat that I ran in Bali was a very small group of 10 people,
Mm-hmm.
most of whom had been clients.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to Bali a few days before the retreat and realized what I almost like, oh my God, what have you done? You brought a
Yeah.
bunch of clients to, a foreign country,
Mm.
and they've got very little meditation practice. And I set up a particular structure because actually all those participants, they weren't, I think 2 of them weren't clients, but it just turned out that they were all women.
Uh-huh.
And we had a painter's studio, and he had some bungalows in his compound. And we rented the studio as a meditation room, and the students stayed in the bungalows. I mean, this is also an interesting story. So I basically structured the schedule to ensure that, because we didn't have mosquito nets in the hall, there wasn't any of those kind of things that you tended to have in places like Burma.
Uh-huh.
I think a couple of people actually, certainly at least one person wasn't staying there. There might have been a couple who weren't staying in the bungalows that surrounded the meditation hall.
Mm-hmm.
And I structured it so that people could be walking to where we practiced together in the morning when it wasn't dark, and they could be going home to wherever they were staying when it wasn't dark. And that was all done out of a concern for safety.
Mm.
Not that Bali's pretty safe,
Mm.
but that's probably just my history. I didn't want my students to feel like they had to walk somewhere in the dark. They might have been fine with it, but
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want that to be another concern that
Mm-hmm.
for them to deal with. So, meeting those conditions, I set up a particular schedule, and it's interesting. I've kept that schedule since that first retreat, which I think
Oh
was
wow.
2011. I
Yeah.
modified it a little bit last October because I couldn't get the dates, and we were heading into really hot weather, and so I changed it to keep people out of the sun.
Mm.
It's it. I remember having an interview once with Sayadaw U Pandita in Burma. In one year, I was interviewing with him one day, and interviewing with whoever was then the abbot, Sayadaw U Pandita. It was actually Sayadaw U Lakana's cousin. His name escapes me at the moment, but I remember leaving U Pandita's kuti. The interview must have been sort of in the middle of the day, And I started walking back to where I was staying. And next minute I had Sayadaw U Pandita standing next to me saying, "You don't need to walk slowly in the sun."
Mm.
And it might seem like like why would you walk slowly in the sun? Well, I'm from Perth in Western Australia, which is very hot. So
Mm-hmm.
it probably wasn't a big deal to me.
Mm-hmm.
But again, to me, it was Sayadaw kind of saying, pay attention to the conditions.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a big thing that I guess I talk about both in seeing clients and as a meditation teacher, is understanding supportive conditions.
Mm-hmm.
What are the conditions that support the development of intelligent understanding? Or other words, wisdom. What are the mental conditions? What are
Mm-hmm.
the environmental conditions? And to go back to that interesting story about Bali, after that first retreat, the artist came up to me and he said, sometimes I get really stressed and I get on my motorbike and I ride up to this place in the north of the island, and it's kind of high, and there's a building there, and across the road from the building is a really nice tree with a view, and I stop under the tree and I just stay there for a while looking at the view. And one time I walked over and I looked into the building to see what was going on there. And when you started teaching this retreat, I realized that what was going on in that building was the same as what was happening here. And
Mm-hmm.
he'd gone to Mahasi Center in the north of Burma, in the north of Bali. There
Mm-hmm.
is a Mahasi Center there. U Pandita has been there. I'm not sure who the teacher is, but the painter now attends the Bali retreat. So whenever I'm teaching there, he sits in on as much of the retreat as he can.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
So it's one of they're just really kind of, I don't know, just it feels like you land in the right, sometimes you land in the right place.
Uh-huh. Right. Yeah. We were talking about before to bring it full circle. And
Mm.
as you have then gone to develop a career in psychology and therapy, this is this these connections between understanding one's psychology and going to a therapist, and then going on a meditation course in the West, especially in the Insight tradition. This has become, these linkages have really been emphasized by some, and that indeed many meditation teachers in the West and the US also have this background in psychotherapy. And there's been much discussion in terms of where these two fields are connected, where they support each other, and where, from both sides, both from the Buddhist meditative side and the psychological side, there have also been some pushbacks in terms of uh, where one field kind of has to stake its ground, or to or to look at certain principles not being usurped or combined or integrated into something else. This is an ongoing discussion and debate that many various people have different angles to it. So being someone that has lived and practiced and worked so much in both of these fields, where do you find the connection, the similarities, the overlap happening between Buddhist meditation and going to a therapist and psychology? And where, if at all, do you see any cause for concern or care, just a bit of demarcating the differences between them?
Well, certainly, up until the early 2000s, um, I felt very little affinity with psychology. Um, Maybe driven by also my colleagues not really knowing what I was doing. Maybe I didn't know what I was doing either. I was just teaching people to meditate. And in the early 2000s, meditation started to become introduced into psychology in Australia. Again, this is way later than the States. So up until that point, the two were very separate. So meditation was some sort of, a bit hocus pocus. I can remember my supervisor when I graduated and I started at the pain clinic. I would go to him for supervision, and I talked to him about the meditation practice, and he'd just say, "Show me the evidence, Lynn. When you show me the evidence, then I'll listen." And he actually was at a conference maybe 10 years later. There was an International Association for the Study of Pain conference in Sydney that I presented at, probably with a couple of other psychologist colleagues, and spoke about meditation practice and got people, I gave people a little bit of an instruction in the practice. And at that point I sat down, and I sat down next to him, and he said something along the lines of, well, I think I'm getting an idea, or, so it took quite a long time for psychology in Australia to begin to incorporate your meditation. It was situations like that. I think John Kabat-Zinn came somewhere in the late, maybe 2000, or maybe around that time. And some of the psychologists I was working with went to his workshop and would then say things to me like, I think I understand, a bit more now about what you've been doing, but I'm not going to do it because I don't want to be a meditator. I don't want to do meditation retreats, so I won't be doing it. You go 10 years beyond that, and I think there's plenty of people talking about meditation to their clients and maybe teaching them or setting them up with some kind of app, but the clinician doesn't necessarily meditate themselves. So I think also I've come to psychology, but I was first involved in meditation. And there may well be a difference between someone who's been a practitioner and has then done psychology, undertaken a psychology training, to someone who's undertaken a psychology training and then become a practitioner. So they may well have a different kind of slant on how the process is unfolding. But to me, without sort of, necessarily using Buddhist language, but I'm going to, I think the Dharma is the bigger box, so to speak. The Dharma is the bigger picture.
Sure.
And so, psychology is going to sit inside of that. I think a lot of psychologists would say it's not, as much as we've got our society demanding that we provide evidence-based treatments, a lot of psychologists would say it's not about the modality, it's about the relationship. And it's a therapeutic relationship. And sure, there's a lot of people who are going to be looking for, the quick fix and give me some techniques and some strategies. And maybe they're not necessarily the people who are going to apply themselves to a meditation practice. I feel like it's harder to get clients to practice regularly. I could get people at the pain clinic to practice for 45 minutes a day.
Hmm.
When I get people to do that these days, they're fine.
Wow.
But getting them to do that is an uphill battle.
Yeah.
So, and I guess the whole introduction of apps, and
Yeah.
like I say to people, when you're listening to that app, it's not the same as doing the practice without
Hmm.
listening to the, you
Uh-huh.
so most of that is kind of lost on maybe people coming to therapy, but they may well still be benefiting from what the practice has done for me, in the way that I engage with them.
Anytime a spiritual tradition moves and migrates across culture and space and time, uh, it, it's natural for it to take on
Mm,
some of the characteristics and understanding of that culture where it's going into. And it's, just as, might sound silly to give this comparison, but just as Buddhism moved into Tibet so many centuries ago and made use of the Tibetan mythology and belief system of the people then, which is then integrated into contemporary Tibetan Buddhism. So also the Western mind and the type of Western mind that was interested in meditation, and not, the more um, open-minded, progressive, kind of alternative folk were, to give that analogy about that Sayadaw U Pandita said, it's not a pork that's stewing in its own juices, it's a tofu that's stirring in its own
mm,
marinade, we can
mm,
say, because
mm,
that's so many of the people, Westerners that are coming in are fitting into some kind of classification of people, you could say, generally more vegetarian, and also many of them having, as pre-Buddhist Tibet had its own belief system that many people fell into. Many of the Westerners that have fallen into Buddhism come with an interest in psychology and therapy, and
mm.
so it's natural that they would make these connections as they go. And I think this is, as you look at the migration, this is also where one has to just make those demarcations of, where is this a skillful way to be able to combine and integrate the contemporary understanding and interest in whatever it is, whether it's old Tibetan gods or a modern version of Western psychology. Where are you able to integrate these together so that 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 this makes more sense, and people can bring this in their lives, and where does it start to water down to the extent that you're really losing something by the attempt to give it a contemporary understanding with the society you're working with. So I think that's why it's this ongoing discussion and exploration, because it's not totally clear, and there's different perceptions and biases of how these can go together or not go together in some ways.
Yeah, and I think that that's the nature of it, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
And um, are we going to kill it off?
Yeah, or are we
Or
going to save it?
are we going to save it? And it sort of
Right.
looked for a while there like we were going to save it. Starting to
Mm.
look a bit like we're going to kill it off at the moment.
And that also to bring another part full circle, what's going on in Burma today. And and I'll leave you with this last question to kind of close off. These 2 hours have really flown by, really been wonderful to spend it with you. And um, as we look at what's going on in Burma, Burma's all but closed off to Western practitioners. We don't know how long this is going to keep going, and obviously it's nothing compared to what the Burmese themselves are going through. But for those Western practitioners, monastics, teachers, etc., the Myanmar is not open as it's been in previous years, and so the access to its centers and monasteries and teachers and the wider Burmese Buddhist culture that we talk about, just being within this culture that is teaching you things beyond a simple technique,
Mm.
that with this closed off, how, in what ways do you think it could have an impact on the refinement and understanding and practice of Buddhism and meditation in the West, not being able to have that access and interaction and travel as before? And I'll just kind of, before leaving that question to you, just talk a bit about the context of the question. There are we've spoken to many people on here who have talked about what what that decreased access means really in tangible terms, um, and how that interaction continues to heighten and refine the Buddhist approach in the West. There's a counter argument to it that is more of, well, we've gotten these teachings, we've gotten these treasures, and we're good now. And yes, it's kind of sad what's happening in Myanmar, but we've been able to get the core of what this practice is in ways that weren't understood in the West before, and we're good. It's we hope that could be resolved sooner, as we hope with Gaza and Ukraine and Syria and everything else. But as far as the Buddhist communities and Sangha and practice goes here, we've uh, we've kind of already exported what we need to know. And so I've heard both sorts of views, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are. Someone who spent a lot of time over there, has a lot of connections, and is doing and working with communities here. The fact that yourself, as well as any of your students, any of your peers, at this time can't go and get that benefit from spending extended time there. How do you think that does impact the experience of teaching and learning and practicing meditation in Australia and other places around the world now?
Um, well, I think a big part of that is the actual exposure of the practitioner to the, a group of people practicing in somewhere like the Mahasi Center, but also to the teachers themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I feel immensely fortunate that I was able to be in Burma at a time when there was still, and I don't know, maybe somewhere in the forest. I mean, some of my Burmese friends say things like, or used to say at least,
Mm-hmm.
things like, oh, there's still a lot of people practicing, they're hidden in the forest, they're still, potential for great teachers. But I think meeting people like Mahasi, I had an interview with Mahasi at the end of my first retreat there, and it was, you're in the presence of something that is very hard to describe.
Mm-hmm.
There's some kind of recognition with it, but to try to describe what it is would make it sound like it was nothing, which is probably what it was. You felt like you were in front of nothing, but nothing at the same time that was, trustworthy and true. And I've probably had that with, only just a handful of people that I met in Burma. But I think it's one of those situations when you've never had the opportunity to meet with that. You don't know what you haven't experienced. You don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of respect for the practice, after one of my retreats in Burma, I don't think it was the first one. But, okay, so after the first retreat in Burma, I had a couple of days before I was leaving, and there was a young American woman who'd come to practice at the Mahasi Center. She'd been ordained with Taungpulu Sayadaw, but I can't remember how long she'd been practicing in the north of Burma. She said the conditions were just too hard. So she'd come down to practice at the Mahasi Center, and we went into town together. So she had a shaved head. She was wearing the brown robes of a forest nun. and I at the time was wearing the brown lungi or sarong of the Mahasi female meditators wore,
Right.
and a blouse. We
Yeah.
went into town, and we were standing outside of a shop and debating whether we should get a Pepsi. Coca-Cola had pulled out of Burma. Pepsi was still selling, and we're just standing there. And next minute, we both had a can of Pepsi. This woman had seen what we were doing, and she just immediately bought us Pepsi and gave it to us.
Yeah.
And we were like, oh. Anyway, we have our Pepsi, and then we're walking around a little bit more. And because of all the time I'd spent in India, I sort of pull up outside of an Indian chai shop looking at the jalebi, which is a sweet that I used to really like, and we're sort of chatting about whether we should get some jalebi, next minute we've got jalebi.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of like, we better stop doing this, because, where do you experience something like that? I've never experienced, the Burmese man waiting at the train in Mandalay, and, one of those retreats in Burma, the president of the center, Ullah Chang, at that time, it was Dr. Ubagale when I was first there, but he retired, and Ullah Chang became the next president. And after my retreat, Ullah Chang took me to the airport, and the airport in Rangoon was nothing like it is now. It was, just, stuff piled everywhere, and little booths, and people with your name on your flight on a clipboard, and it's just like chaos.
Yeah.
And he led me through the airport, and he just kept saying, Mahasi Yogi, Mahasi Yogi, Mahasi Yogi. And it was like the waves parted, It's like,
wow.
I mean, I doubt that's going to happen today.
Yeah.
But to see the respect,
yeah,
not just the care, but the respect people had. Burmese people would often say to you, even in the later years when I was in Burma, when they knew you were there to do a retreat, it was like, oh, gee, wow, that's amazing that you do. Oh, that's really difficult. That's too hard. I couldn't, they knew what you were undertaking, but they also had a huge amount of respect for it.
Yeah.
So, and then you were in the presence of teachers like Shui Umin side, or Mahasi side, or Sayadaw Kundala, and who wherever they are has just permeated the space around them. That's what we've lost access to. But I guess I'm also heartened to some degree by the stories of, or what we've read about, the 1800s, and when people weren't really practicing, even in Burma, except, maybe monks and nuns. People thought that the only people who could practice were monks and nuns, but the monks and nuns, probably weren't doing the kind of practice that, Mahasi laid out, especially for lay people, and, just decided to take themselves off into the forest and see if this stuff that they'd memorized, from the texts and the suttas actually worked, and found that it did. So do things have to get worse, and then we maybe when they get worse, and people sort of realize they've got to bear down a bit more and on the resources that they've got available to them, and I don't know, maybe it's just another cycle. I mean, I certainly would hope we'd be able to go back to Burma.
Yeah.
It certainly feels like, it feels like home.
In what way?
It would always feel like when I landed in Burma that I was safe.
Mm,
And also probably that you were, I mean, Burma's very different to India, as you probably know.
yeah.
And certainly in those days, in going to Burma, you felt like what you were doing wasn't unusual.
Yeah. Right. I know the feeling.
Hmm. You, you,
Yeah.
didn't, you didn't have to explain, like, why on earth would you go and do something like that, Um, so yeah, it felt like you could relax.
Even though the practice itself was so intensive.
Yeah, yeah. But everyone understood that it was hard, but everyone was doing it anyway. Well, all the
Hmm.
people wherever you were practicing.
And that does give a kind of momentum and encouragement to break through certain barriers that are harder to do without that environment. That's another kind of going back to what you get in Burma that you might not get practiced in other places. That could be one other aspect there.
Yeah, and I think the last time I was in Burma, um, I'm trying to remember the year. Baru Kundala had died. I think I went back a couple more times to Thadamoransi. But, it's interesting. It's about the teacher, the center wasn't the same.
I'm sure, yeah. Hmm.
And I did a few things up in Tinuluin,
Hmm.
um, Memu,
Hmm.
with he's more of he's an academic sort of side, or I guess he's a registrar of the International
Hmm.
University, or he
Dr. Nandamala.
yes.
Hmm.
And even the setup of the center was interesting because it's this big sort of study, this big hall. It's mostly used for lectures, and then you sort of go behind that. I don't know if you've ever been there, but
Mm.
there is a small meditation center, a small meditation sala or um, hall once you get further into the property. But the first thing is the really big hall where he teaches from. It's a great place to sit, but mostly it's used for I think a sitting in the morning, and then for lectures. And Sayadaw Nandamala, his he says he doesn't teach meditation,
Hmm.
and he believes that you need to study before
Right.
you practice,
Hmm.
which I certainly don't believe.
Hmm.
um,
Mm.
so I I went there a few times, 2 or 3 times, but it didn't resonate with me. And I did a little bit of a tour around the area because some of the other side of Ulakana, for one, has a center there. There were some fantastic meditation centers there,
Mm.
and no one in them. No teacher.
Mm. Yeah, that does make a difference for sure.
Yeah. So you can have the place, but um, we've got to keep we've got to keep growing teachers, and certainly a place like that can help with the growth of teachers. Uh, but I think it's not the only condition.
Hmm. Right. Yeah, there's so many different conditions and factors that go into that environment. And I think what I appreciate so much about Burma is just the diversity and depth of what is offered. There's a place for everyone. There's a place for whatever style of practice and instruction and environment that you're looking for,
Hmm.
and coming from the West, I think different from you, where you found this practice in Burma and then were instrumental in bringing it to the West. But for me, having started the practice over here and seeing that core structure, it was just such an opening, such a buffet table, a kaleidoscope of
Uh-huh.
what was in front of you. And as I think the two things you hit upon that were really true for me, that I really want to emphasize for listeners, is this sense, on one hand, this sense of safety that that you're going into, and the other sense, normalcy. That, and these are two things that are not givens anywhere you go. Just this sense of complete, for me at least, a sense of safety and protection and shelter and care that was really found throughout, combined with this normalcy and encouragement of what I was doing. And
Yeah,
that is something really hard to replicate, those two features.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
Hmm.
But it's interesting, a place like Bali. Most people who haven't been to Bali, or even a lot of people who have, probably associate Bali these days with, kudu and seminyak, and even
Mm,
maybe ubud, and the Australian sort of outer suburb of Sydney or Darwin or somewhere where there's clubs and drinking and drugs and etc.
right.
etc.
Yeah.
But the Balinese culture, even though it's, you know, you would probably say it was largely Hindu, it's
Hmm.
been affected by Buddhism.
Mm,
So they're working hard to maintain their culture. And given the onslaught that they've faced, especially, from the West, you know, Australia and probably, Europe as well, they've got a strong practice culture. It's a different practice, it's much more, in terms of, say, Buddhism, the, there's a lot of mandala kind of style practices with the making of offerings and the offering of offerings, and uh, there's so much around what they do that's informed by their practice culture. And
mm,
you go and sit, we practice at the studio of the painter Kaja, um, and the family are so respectful of what we're doing.
mm, yeah.
And you'll see them moving around at designated times during the day, wearing their traditional clothes, carrying a tray of offerings, making offerings to the various statues, really focused on what they're doing. It's still really built in
Mm,
to their way of life, and still really looked after. And I think really felt. It's one of the things that makes Bali so special, when you can get away from the commercialization of the landscape, you know,
mm,
and the commercialization of the culture that's mostly been commercialized by Westerners, not actually by the Balinese. Um, you still feel that you're in a culture that understands practice.
that's great. Yeah, to definitely other places that bring that awareness and that allow mindfulness to continue to take off and to be practiced. And I really appreciate all the time that you took to sit down and share your story and bring some thoughts to our audience. And it was great to learn all of this. So thanks for that time that you spent with us here.
Oh, also, thank you very much, Joa. It's
Hmm.
been very enjoyable to talk to you about it. It's not, again, still not that many people that you talk to about that sort of thing. So certainly where I'm sitting, anyway,
Hmm.
you've probably got a lot more opportunity, or you've made a lot more opportunities to do that. So thank you for that as well. I've um, been reading a bit more of what's come through, um, from the interviews that you've done as well. So it's nice to sit down and have those to read and feel that kind of connection to people who are also connected to Burma.
since the coup, Better Burma has provided consistent humanitarian aid to vulnerable communities across Myanmar. Over time, however, we have also come to realize that another consequence of the coup is a severely collapsed economy. Trade and tourism have almost entirely evaporated, and local artisan communities suddenly found every opportunity of continuing livelihood closed off to them. To help support those artisan communities, Better Burma now brings items direct from their workshop into your home. These lovely pieces from a far corner of the world will not only light up your room or make a lovely gift for a loved one, but they'll also help dozens of artisans create sustainable businesses and livelihoods. Part of each purchase will also go towards our ongoing nonprofit mission. To see these beautiful crafts, visit alokacrafts.com. That's Aloka, A-L-O-K-A, crafts, C-R-A-F-T-S, one word, alokacrafts.com. Of course, as is your preference, you can also consider making a donation through our normal channels. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam boda yaranamano